The only light was a sliver of moon, sharp as a fishhook snagged in the black canvas of the sky. It was enough. It had to be. Eliza slid from the back of the preacher's wagon, her bare feet meeting the cold, gritty earth without a sound. Above her, the heavy canvas flap settled back into place, sealing the stale air of piety and sweat inside. The preacher, a man whose hands knew the Bible and a woman's bruises with equal intimacy, was a heavy sleeper. His snores rumbled from the front of the wagon, a rhythmic grunting that had been the soundtrack to her misery for 6 long years. She did not pause to look back. To look back was to risk seeing the painted letters on the side of the wagon. The Lord's voice in the wilderness, and the lie of it would have frozen her to the spot. There was no God in that wagon, only a man named Brother Hawthorne who smelled of whiskey and righteousness, and his thin, silent wife whose eyes held a permanent apology. Eliza had been sold to them as a girl of 14, an orphan with no name worth keeping, to be a ward and a helper. She had learned quickly what helping meant. Her dress, a faded calico worn thin as a prayer, was torn at the shoulder and snagged on the splintered wood as she slipped away. She felt a sharp sting in the sole of her foot and kept moving. Pain was an old companion. It was the silence she craved. The wagon and its slow, creaking journey toward damnation faded behind her as she scrambled up the first incline, her hands grabbing at scrub brush and sharp-edged rocks. The forested foothills of the New Mexico territory swallowed her whole. She was a ghost leaving a life that had already killed her spirit. Now, she was running to save the body. The land was not kind. It was a brutal teacher, offering lessons in thirst and pain with an unsparing hand. By the second day, the sun was a hammer beating down on her head, bleaching the world to a shimmering, dusty white. The soles of her feet, tender at first, were now a crisscross of cuts and deep bruises. Thornbrush tore at her dress and her skin, leaving angry red lines on her arms and legs. She thought of water constantly, a waking dream of cool, clear streams that vanished the moment she tried to grasp them. Her throat was a knot of dry dust. She learned the sounds of this new, hard world. The dry rattle of a snake coiled in the shade of a rock, a sound that sent ice through her veins and made her scramble backward, her heart pounding against her ribs. The skittering of a scorpion across the baked earth. At night, the air grew cold with a suddenness that stole the breath, and the high, lonesome cry of coyotes echoed from the ridges, speaking of a hunger that matched her own. She ate bitter berries that cramped her stomach and chewed on the leaves of a tough, waxy plant that offered a few drops of moisture and little else. She was not sure how many days she walked. Time melted into a blur of scorching sun and cold, star-filled nights. The memory of the wagon, of Brother Hawthorne's heavy hands and his wife's vacant pity, began to fade, replaced by the more immediate tyranny of her body's demands. She was starving. She was dehydrated. Her mind began to play tricks on her, conjuring shimmering lakes in the distance and the scent of baking bread on the wind. She stumbled more than she walked, her vision blurring at the edges. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting low and painting the hills in shades of rust and gold. When she saw it, a thin curl of smoke, almost invisible against the vast, empty sky. For a moment, she thought it was another hallucination, a cruel trick of a dying mind, but she kept her eyes fixed on it, forcing one foot in front of the other, her body a dead weight she had to drag forward. Hope, a feeling she had long since buried, flickered like a dying ember in her chest. She crested a low ridge, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, and saw the cabin. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, nestled in a grove of hardy pines that clung to the rocky soil. It looked as lonely and weather-beaten as she felt. A solitary place, built by a man who did not want to be found. That was a feeling she understood. She tried to call out, but the only sound that escaped her cracked lips was a dry, rasping croak. Her legs gave out from under her. The world tilted, the pine trees and the log cabin swimming in a brown, dusty haze. She fell to her knees, then pitched forward, her face hitting the hard-packed earth. The last thing she was aware of was the rough texture of the ground against her cheek and the merciful darkness that finally claimed her. Silas found her an hour later, returning from checking his trap lines. At first, he saw only a bundle of faded cloth and tangled hair, a heap of rags someone might have discarded. He approached with caution, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle he carried. The wilderness was full of surprises, and most of them were dangerous. It was only when he was a few feet away that he saw the slender arm, the pale, dirt-streaked skin. He saw that the rags were a woman. He knelt, his worn leather chaps creaking in the quiet air. He gently turned her over. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp beneath a layer of grime. Her lips were split and bleeding. A dark bruise, the color of a faded plum, stained her jawline. She was breathing, a faint, shallow flutter in her chest. She was half-starved and near death from thirst. He had seen men in the war look this way, their bodies giving up long after their spirits had fled. For a long moment, Silas did nothing. He was a man who had come to these hills seeking solitude, a quiet penance for a past that was loud with gunfire and screams. A woman was trouble. A woman brought questions and complications, and a world he had worked hard to leave behind. His first instinct was to ride to the nearest settlement, a place called Dusty Creek, a full day's ride away, and leave her to the mercy of the law or a doctor. But a day's ride might as well be a lifetime for someone in her state. And looking at her, at the raw, brutalized state of her, he knew that the law was likely the very thing she was running from. With a sigh that seemed to pull up from the soles of his boots, he made his decision. He carefully scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a collection of sharp bones and fragile hope. He carried her inside the cabin, the familiar scent of pine wood, wood smoke, and solitude enveloping them. He laid her gently on the simple cot in the corner, her head resting on a pillow stuffed with dried grass. He pulled off her ruined, dirt-caked shoes, which were barely clinging to her feet, and saw the blood and blisters. He fetched a bucket of cool water from the well, tore a strip from a clean cloth, and began to gently wash the dirt from her face. He worked with a slow, methodical patience, his hands, calloused and rough from an axe and reins, surprisingly gentle. He left a tin cup of water on the small crate beside the cot and then sat in his own chair across the small room to wait. He did not know if he was helping or just delaying the inevitable, but he would wait. Eliza woke to a world of shadows and quiet. The first thing she registered was the ceiling. It was not the stained canvas of the wagon top, but a roof of rough, interlocking logs. The air did not smell of stale sweat and false piety. It smelled of wood smoke and something clean, like pine. For a blissful, disoriented moment, she felt nothing but a dull ache in her bones. Then memory came rushing back. The escape, the sun, the thirst, the collapse. She sat up with a jolt, her eyes wide with animal panic. A man sat in a chair across the room, watching her. He was silhouette against the dying light from the single window, a broad-shouldered shape, still and silent. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. It was a man. Men were the architects of her pain. A strangled cry tore from her throat. She scrambled off the cot, her bare feet hitting the cold wooden floorboards. She backed away from him, her hands held out as if to ward off a blow. "Stay back," she rasped, her voice raw and unfamiliar. The man did not move. He simply watched her, his face unreadable in the gloom. She fumbled behind her, her hands searching for a weapon, a lock, a way out. Her fingers brushed against the rough wood of the cabin door. She clawed at it, searching for a latch, a handle, anything. It was solid, unyielding. She was trapped. "Do not touch me," she whispered, the words a desperate prayer. She turned to face him, her back pressed against the door, her whole body trembling. She could see him more clearly now. He was not old, but his face was carved with the lines of a hard life. His eyes were calm, but they held a deep, unshakable weariness. His shirt was worn, his hands were calloused. He looked like the mountains themselves, rugged and quiet and unforgiving. He slowly raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. "I will not," he said. His voice was low and quiet, like the rumble of distant thunder. He rose from his chair, and she flinched, pressing herself harder against the door. He stopped immediately. He did not take another step toward her. He simply stood there, a silent acknowledgement of the terror in her eyes. It was this stillness, this stepping back, that was so foreign to her. Brother Hawthorne would have strode forward, his face tight with righteous anger, and grabbed her by the arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. This man just stood and waited. He said very little over the next few hours. His language was one of gestures. He gestured to the tin cup of water on the crate. She stared at it, her thirst a raging fire in her throat, but she did not move. He gestured to a pot simmering over the hearth, the smell of venison stew filling the small cabin, a scent so rich and savory it made her stomach cramp with a painful, hollow ache. He set a bowl of it on the floor, halfway between them, then retreated to his side of the room. He did not push, did not command. For a long time, she refused. Pride and fear were a powerful wall, but her body was a traitor. The scent of the stew was a relentless torment. Finally, shaking, she slid down the door to the floor, her eyes never leaving him. She crawled toward the bowl like a feral animal, grabbed it with trembling hands, and retreated to her corner. She ate with her fingers, scooping the meat and broth into her mouth with a desperate, frantic hunger. She did not stop until the bowl was clean, her shame a hot flush on her cheeks. She had not eaten a full meal in days, subsisting on the scraps and leftovers the Hawthorns deemed fit for her. This was more than she had eaten in a week. When she was done, he silently took the bowl and placed a worn wool blanket on the floor in its place. He gestured toward the cot. It was an offer, not an order. Hesitantly, she rose and moved to the cot, wrapping the blanket around her thin shoulders. She lay down, her back to him, every muscle in her body tensed, waiting for the sound of his footsteps, the weight of his hand, but it never came. She heard only the crackle of the fire and the sound of his steady, quiet breathing from the other side of the room. The days that followed were a study in silence. The landscape outside the cabin was as punishing as the one she had crossed to get there. The sun baked the earth until it cracked. Dust devils spun across the plains below, angry red funnels of dirt. Sudden violent summer storms would roll in without warning, the sky turning a bruised purple, lightning splitting the heavens and thunder shaking the very foundations of the cabin. At night, the coyotes would cry, their voices a symphony of wild, aching loneliness. The old cabin would groan and settle in the wind, a living thing sighing in the darkness. Inside, the silence was just as vast. She refused to give him her name, and he did not ask for it. They existed in the small space like two ghosts, breathing the same air, sharing the same fire, but never crossing the invisible line that divided the room. He would rise before dawn, chop wood, hunt, and tend to his small, rugged garden. She would watch, at first from the cot, then from the doorway. He moved with a quiet efficiency, a man long accustomed to being alone. They never spoke of her past. He never asked where she had come from, or what the bruises on her arms meant. He simply left food and water for her, and a stack of his own worn shirts and trousers, which were too big but offered more protection than her tattered dress. Slowly, tentatively, she began to move about the cabin. She swept the floor with a handmade broom. She washed their bowls in the basin, small acts of domesticity that felt both strange and grounding. She was earning her keep, not as a servant, but as a silent partner in this shared survival. But the nights were her enemy. The darkness would pull the memories from the deep, locked places in her mind. She would wake up screaming, the feel of Brother Hawthorne's hands on her, his whiskey-sour breath on her face. She would bolt upright in the cot, her heart hammering, the scream still caught in her throat. The first time it happened, Silas was awake in an instant, his rifle in his hands before he was even fully conscious. He saw her on the cot, trembling, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He saw the terror that lingered in the room, a palpable, ugly thing. He did not go to her. He did not speak. He understood that his comfort would feel like a threat. So he just stood by the door, his rifle held loosely at his side, and waited. He stood guard against the ghosts. He waited until her sobs quieted, until her breathing evened out, until the quiet returned. He did this every time it happened, his silent vigil a strange and profound form of comfort. He was not trying to fix her pain, only to stand witness to it. One morning, after a particularly bad night, she found him outside, sharpening an axe blade on a wet stone. The sun was just rising, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of pink and gray. She stood in the doorway, the coarse wool of his shirt rough against her skin. She had to say something, to warn him of the poison she carried within her. "You should send me away," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He did not stop the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone. "Nowhere to send you," he said without looking up. "I am trouble. Trouble will find me. It will find you, too." He finally stopped and looked at her. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they seemed to see right through her, to the scared and broken girl hiding beneath the layers of hardness she had built around herself. "Trouble finds everyone, sooner or later," he said. She took a step closer, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had to make him understand. She was not worthy of this quiet, unquestioning kindness. She was tainted, ruined. "You will regret touching me," she warned, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was not a threat. It was a prophecy, a curse she carried. Silas looked down at his own hands, at the calluses and the old, faded scars that mapped his knuckles. He thought of the war, of the things he had done, of the man he had been. He looked back at her, at the fear and defiance warring in her eyes. He replied softly, his voice barely more than a whisper on the cool morning air. "I do not plan to—" The days bled one into the next, measured not by a calendar, but by the slow, steady rhythm of survival. The sun would rise, flooding the high ridges with a clean, golden light. And Silas would already be up, the sound of his axe splitting wood a steady heartbeat in the quiet morning. The sun would set, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, and they would sit in the growing dark, the silence between them as vast and profound as the landscape outside. Eliza's body began to mend. The hollows in her cheeks filled out, and the desperate, haunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a watchful stillness. The cuts on her feet healed into pale white lines, and the bruises on her arms faded from angry purple to a sickly yellow-green, and then disappeared altogether, leaving no trace on her skin of the hands that had put them there. But she knew the marks were still there, deeper than the eye could see. She still woke some nights with a silent scream caught in her throat, the ghosts of the past reaching for her in the dark. But now, when she woke, she would see the solid shadow of Silas, a silent sentinel by the door, and the fear would recede, like a tide pulling away from the shore. She began to claim a space for herself in the small cabin. At first, it was small things. She started to cook, taking the rabbits and grouse he brought back from his trap lines and turning them into savory stews, using the wild herbs she found growing in the sheltered places between the rocks. The scent of roasting meat and simmering broth began to fill the cabin, a warm, domestic smell that pushed back against the cold loneliness of the place. She gathered firewood, her arms growing strong from carrying the heavy loads of pine and juniper. She learned the feel of the land, the crunch of dry leaves under her feet, the sharp, clean scent of the pines after a rain. She was no longer a ghost in his house. She was a presence, a quiet force that was slowly changing the shape of his solitude. He never asked her a single question about where she'd come from. He never asked her name. He called her nothing at all. And in a strange way, that felt like a kindness. It allowed her to be simply who she was in this moment, a woman breathing the free air of the mountains, not the girl who had been bought and sold. With her fear of him lessening, she began to truly see him. She saw the things that his silence did not say. In the corner of the cabin, folded neatly on a wooden crate, was a worn Union Army jacket. The blue wool was faded to a soft, dusty gray, and there was a small, frayed hole on the left breast, just over the heart. Sometimes, when the night grew cold, he would put it on, and the set of his shoulders would change, becoming straighter, more rigid, as if he were putting on a weight he could never truly take off. She saw the bullet hole in the wall, just to the right of the window. It was old, the wood around it splintered and dark. It was not the mark of a stray shot from a hunting rifle. It was lower, at the height of a seated man's chest. It was a hole that told a story of violence that had found its way into this place of quiet. And she noticed the limp in his walk. It was subtle, something he tried to hide, but it was there, when he was tired. After a long day of tracking or chopping wood, he favored his right leg, a slight drag in his step that spoke of an old injury, a pain that had settled deep into his bones. The jacket, the bullet hole, the limp. They were pieces of a puzzle she did not dare to ask him to solve. But they told her that he, too, was a survivor of a private war. He, too, had scars. One night, the sky broke open. A summer storm, more violent than any that had come before, raged through the hills. Lightning tore across the black sky, illuminating the world in stark, skeletal flashes of white. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the teeth in her skull. The wind howled like a banshee, and rain lashed against the small cabin, seeking out every crack and crevice. The fire in the hearth was their only anchor in the storm, a small island of warmth and light in a world gone mad. They sat near it, not speaking, listening to the fury of the storm. The wind found a loose shutter on the window, and it banged against the frame with a rhythmic, unnerving persistence. Eliza was wearing her old calico dress, the one she had arrived in. She had washed it and mended it as best she could, but it was still threadbare, and the tear at the shoulder remained, a ragged gap that exposed the curve of her shoulder, her skin pale in the firelight. Silas sat across from her, staring into the flames, his face a mask of shadows and light. He seemed lost in thought, his mind miles away from the storm. But she saw his eyes flicker toward her bare shoulder, and then quickly look away, his jaw tight. He was a man holding himself in check, a man who had built a fortress around himself. She did not know what made her say it. Perhaps it was the raw power of the storm, which stripped away all pretense and left only the elemental truths. Perhaps it was the sight of him looking away, a gesture of respect so profound and so foreign to her that it cracked something open inside her. She leaned forward, her voice a whisper beneath the roar of the wind. "You'll regret this," she said again. But this time, the words were different. They were not a warning. They were not a prophecy. They were a question. They were a plea. They held all the fear and longing of a woman who was beginning to hope, and who knew that hope was the most dangerous thing of all. Silas did not move. He kept his eyes fixed on the fire, but she saw a muscle jump in his cheek. He was listening. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. The storm raged outside, and a private storm raged within the walls of the small cabin. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "I served with the 3rd Cavalry," he began, his eyes still on the fire, as if the story were written in the flames. Fought at Gettysburg, saw things no man should see, but that was not the worst of it. He paused and took a deep, shuddering breath. After, we were sent to clean up the border skirmishes, jayhawkers and bushwhackers. It was not a clean war, it was just killing. He fell silent again, and Eliza waited, holding her breath. She knew this was a key, a secret he had kept locked away for a long time. We cornered a man in a farmhouse. He had burned a neighbor's homestead, killed his family. We were sent to bring him in, but he would not come out. He started shooting. We returned fire. A lamp was knocked over. The place went up like a tinderbox. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, the voice of a man who had told the story to himself 1,000 times. The house was burning, and he was still inside, screaming. My captain ordered us to let it burn, said it was God's justice. But I saw his wife, or maybe his daughter, in the window of an upper room. She was trapped. I went in. He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw the reflection of the fire, and the reflection of another fire, one that had burned a long time ago. I got her out, but the man, he came at me with a knife. He was burning, his clothes were on fire, but he came at me. I shot him. I killed a man who was already burning to death. I can still smell it sometimes. The smoke, the fear, his and mine. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. I never went home after that. My family had a farm in Ohio. A good place, but I could not take what I had become back to them. So I came here, where the land is hard enough to make you forget everything but staying alive. The story hung in the air between them. A raw and honest thing. He had given her a piece of his brokenness. She felt an overwhelming urge to give him a piece of her own. My mother died when I was born, she whispered, the words stiff and unused. My father, he was a drinker. He sold me to Brother Hawthorne and his wife when I was 14. He said they would give me a good Christian home. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. He was a preacher. He traveled from town to town, saving souls. He said I was his ward. He said he was saving my soul, too. She fell silent, unable to say more, but she did not have to. The bruises had faded, but Silas had seen them. He understood. Her fear of touch remained, a ghost that haunted her every waking moment. It was a wall she had built around herself, brick by painful brick. But now, there were cracks in that wall. She found herself watching his hands as he worked, mending a bridle or carving a piece of wood. They were strong, capable hands. They were not the hands of Brother Hawthorne. One evening, they were sitting by the fire, the comfortable silence having returned between them. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and economical. She was mending one of his shirts, the needle awkward in her unpracticed fingers. He reached for a cleaning cloth, and his arm brushed against hers. It was an accident, a fleeting, momentary contact, but a jolt went through her, hot and sharp, like a brand. She flinched back so violently that she dropped the shirt, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked down at her arm, at the place where he had touched her, as if she expected to see a burn mark on her skin. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and shame. He had frozen, his hand still outstretched. He said nothing. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he slowly pulled his arm back and went back to cleaning his rifle, his movements just as precise as before, but with a new, deliberate slowness. He was giving her space. He was letting her breathe. It was a few days later that the riders appeared. Silas saw them first. He was on a high ridge, checking his snares, when he saw two figures on horseback on the opposite side of the valley. They were too far away to make out their faces, but they were not cowboys or prospectors. They rode with a purpose, their eyes scanning the hills. He watched them for a long time, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. They were looking for something, or someone. He went back to the cabin and did not tell her what he had seen. but she knew something was wrong. He was quieter than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He kept his rifle close at hand, leaning it against the wall by the door instead of on the rack over the fireplace. That afternoon, she saw them herself. She was gathering water from the stream when she saw them, two dark specks moving slowly along the distant ridge. Panic, cold and familiar, seized her. It was them, it had to be them. Brother Hawthorne had sent them. He would never let her go. She was his property. She dropped the bucket and ran back to the cabin, stumbling over rocks and roots, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She burst through the door, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "They are here," she gasped, leaning against the door frame for support. Silas looked at her, then looked out the door toward the ridge. He did not seem surprised. "They are still a long way off," he said calmly. "They are looking for me. They will find me." He walked over to the crate where his saddlebags lay and pulled out a small, brass spyglass. He went to the window and trained it on the distant figures. He watched for a long time. "We can go," he said, his voice low and even. "There are caves deeper in the mountains, places no one would ever find. We can pack some supplies. Leave tonight. They will never find you." She stared at him. He was offering her a way out. He was offering to go with her, to abandon his home, his solitude, to protect her. The thought of it was so overwhelming that for a moment she could not breathe. But then she thought of running again, of hiding in caves, of always looking over her shoulder, of living the rest of her life as a hunted animal. And something inside her, something hard and resilient that had been buried under years of fear and submission, finally broke free. She straightened up, her chin lifting. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "I will not run anymore." She looked him straight in the eye, and for the first time, he saw not a victim, but a fighter. "Let them come. I am done running." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, perhaps even admiration, passed through his eyes. He nodded slowly. But that night, as she lay on her cot, she saw him checking the load in his rifle, and she saw the grim set of his jaw. Her brave words had not changed the danger. They had only changed the location of the battle. She reached under her pillow and her fingers closed around the handle of the small, sharp skinning knife she had taken from his tool bench. She started sleeping with it again. The tension in the cabin grew thick and heavy in the following days. The riders disappeared, but they both knew they were still out there, circling, patient as vultures. They spoke little, but every shared glance, every moment of shared silence, was charged with the awareness of the coming storm. That night, she could not sleep. The fear was a living thing, coiling in her belly. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, the knife in her lap, her arms wrapped around her knees. The cabin was filled with shadows, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She did not hear him approach. He moved with a hunter's grace, silent on the wooden floorboards. She only knew he was there when his shadow fell over her. She looked up, her hand tightening on the knife. He stood before her, his face unreadable in the faint, red glow of the embers. He looked at her, at the knife in her lap, at the fear in her eyes. He did not speak. He simply knelt in front of her. He slowly, deliberately, reached out his hand. She flinched, her body tensing for a blow, but his hand did not strike. It hovered in the air for a moment, then came to rest on her shoulder, the one that was bare from her torn dress. His touch was not what she expected. It was not heavy or demanding. It was not the bruising, possessive touch of Brother Hawthorne. It was light, so light it was barely there. It was gentle. It was reverent. His calloused fingers rested on her skin, not to take, but to give comfort, to give strength, to offer a silent promise of protection. A tremor went through her entire body. It was a quake that started deep inside and shook her to the very core. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, but she did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, just a fraction of an inch. A small, hesitant movement that was the bravest thing she had ever done. For the first time in a very long time, she was touched with kindness. And in that small, quiet touch, in the heart of the vast, dangerous wilderness, something new and fragile began to grow. The morning after his touch, the air in the cabin had changed. The silence was still there, but it was no longer a space between two strangers. It was a shared quiet, a field lying fallow, waiting, but their peace was short-lived. 2 days later, the riders returned. They did not approach with caution this time. They rode straight up to the cabin as if they owned the land, reining in their horses and stirring up a cloud of pale, choking dust. Eliza was inside, kneading dough for bread, and at the sound of the approaching hooves, she froze, her hands covered in flour. Silas was by the door in an instant, his rifle held loosely in one hand, his body language deceptively calm. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low. "Do not make a sound." He stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door partially closed behind him, and squinted into the harsh midday sun. There were 2 of them, the same men from before. One was a hard-faced man with a drooping mustache and cold, dead eyes. The other was slighter, with a face that was a cruel parody of Brother Hawthorne's. He had the same thin lips, the same self-righteous tilt to his head, but his eyes held a sly, worldly cunning that the preacher tried to conceal. "Afternoon," the hard-faced man said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed uncomfortably close to Silas's boot. "We are looking for a runaway? A young woman. Name of Abigail, though she might call herself something else." Silas leaned against the doorframe, the picture of a man with nothing to hide and all the time in the world. "Can't say I have seen anyone like that," he said, his voice even. "This is a lonely stretch. Not many folks pass through." The preacher's brother, a man who introduced himself as Jonas Hawthorne, leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the cabin. "She is a ward of my brother, the Reverend Hawthorne. Stole some items of value and ran off. She is a troubled girl, prone to fits and lies." His gaze lingered on the cabin's single window, on the neatly stacked firewood, on the small details that might betray a woman's presence. Inside, Eliza held her breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She pressed her ear to the crack in the door, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the wooden slab. Abigail. He had used that name, a name she had not heard in years, a name that belonged to a girl who no longer existed. "I did see a woman," Silas said slowly, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon. "Maybe a week ago. She was half-starved, heading west, gave her some water and a bit of jerky. She did not stay long." The lie was smooth, delivered with a practiced ease that sent a chill down Eliza's spine. He was protecting her. He was putting himself in danger for her. Jonas Hawthorne dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He walked slowly toward the porch, his eyes missing nothing. "A week ago, you say? That is a shame. We had hoped to catch her sooner. My brother is terribly worried for her soul." He stopped at the foot of the steps, looking up at Silas. "You live out here all alone?" "I prefer the quiet," Silas said. Jonas smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of his lips. "I can imagine, but it must get lonesome. A man needs companionship." His eyes flickered toward the closed door. "You mind if we water our horses? It has been a long, hot ride." "The well is over there," Silas said, gesturing with his head. He did not move from his post at the door. As the hard-faced man led the horses to the well, Jonas stayed put, his gaze still fixed on the cabin. "You know, there is a reward for her return," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "My brother is a generous man. He would be very grateful to anyone who helped bring his lost sheep back to the fold." "Like I said," Silas replied, his voice flat. "She passed through. She is long gone by now." Jonas stared at him for a long, tense moment, his suspicion a palpable thing in the hot, still air. Then he shrugged and turned away. "A shame," he said again. They watered their horses, mounted up, and rode off without another word, their backs rigid with displeasure. Silas watched until they were small specks in the distance. Then he came back inside, his face grim. Eliza was standing in the middle of the room, her face pale, her hands trembling. "They will be back," she whispered. "They did not believe you." "No," he said, placing the rifle back by the door. "They did not." "It is my fault," she said, her voice thick with self-loathing. "I have brought this trouble to you. I knew I would." She looked around the small, quiet cabin, at the life he had built for himself, a life she had now endangered. "I will leave tonight. I will go deeper into the hills. They will never find me, and they will leave you be." She turned to go to the cot, to gather the few meager belongings she now possessed, but his voice stopped her. "No." It was a single word, spoken with a quiet finality that was more powerful than any shout. She turned back to him, her eyes wide. "You heard them," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "They will be back. They will hurt you, because of me." He took a step toward her, and then another, until he was standing directly in front of her. He was so close she could see the flecks of gray in his stormy eyes, the deep lines that radiated from their corners. "This is my home," he said, his voice low and intense. "You are in it. The trouble is ours now." He would not let her run. He would not let her face it alone. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. For the first time in her life, someone was standing with her, not against her. The tension in the following days was a sharp, metallic taste in the back of their throats. They worked, they ate, they slept, but the threat of the rider's return hung over them like a hawk circling its prey. Silas began to prepare. He was no longer just a quiet homesteader. He was a soldier again. He cleaned and oiled his rifle and a second weapon, a heavy Colt revolver that he took from a locked wooden box. One afternoon, he took her to a small clearing behind the cabin. In his hand, he held the revolver. "You need to learn how to use this," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. She stared at the gun, at the dark, heavy metal, the squat cylinder, the unforgiving finality of it. It was an object of violence, an instrument of death. She had seen what guns could do. She shook her head. "I cannot." "You must," he insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "I cannot be everywhere at once. If they come, and I am not here, you cannot be helpless." He held the gun out to her. "But first, take it." Her hand trembled as she reached for it. The revolver was surprisingly heavy, cold and solid in her palm. It felt alien, wrong. He stood behind her, his presence a warm, solid wall at her back. He did not touch her, but she could feel his proximity, a stark contrast to the cold metal in her hand. "Hold it with both hands," he instructed. "Keep your arms straight. Look down the barrel. See the sight at the end? Line it up with that dead tree stump over there." She did as he said, her heart pounding. The stump seemed to blur and swim before her eyes. "Breathe," he said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "Breathe out slow, and as you do, squeeze the trigger. Do not jerk it. Squeeze it, gentle as you can." She took a shaky breath, let it out, and squeezed. The gun exploded in her hands, a deafening roar that echoed through the hills. The recoil slammed her shoulders back, and she cried out, stumbling backward into him. His hands shot out and steadied her, holding her upright. The scent of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and sharp. She had missed the stump by a wide margin, the bullet kicking up a puff of dust in the dirt far to the left. She was shaking, her ears ringing. "I cannot do this," she said, her voice thin. "Yes, you can," he said, his hand still firm on her shoulders. Again. They stayed there for hours, until the sun began to dip below the ridge. She fired again and again, the loud report of the gun becoming less of a shock each time. Her arms ached and her hands were sore, but she kept going. Silas was a patient teacher, his voice a steady, calming presence. He corrected her stance, her grip, her breathing. Slowly, her shots grew steadier, closer to the mark. Finally, a shot rang out, and a chunk of bark splintered from the center of the stump. She stared at it, disbelieving. "Good shot," Silas said from behind her. The words were simple, unadorned, but they landed in her heart like a warm spring rain on parched earth. She had been called a sinner, a whore, a thief, a liar. She could not remember the last time anyone had praised her for anything. A strange, unfamiliar feeling bubbled up inside her, and a smile, small and hesitant, touched her lips. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, a faint, answering smile in his own eyes. It was the first time she had truly smiled at him, a genuine, unguarded expression of warmth. And in that moment, in that small clearing with the smell of gunpowder in the air, the world shifted. The isolation, the constant fear, the rising tension between them, it all came to a head that night. The storm that had been brewing inside the cabin finally broke. They sat by the fire, the revolver, now cleaned and loaded, resting on the mantelpiece above them. The air was thick with things unsaid, with a longing that was as sharp and painful as a fresh wound. Eliza looked into the flames, her hands clenched in her lap. She could no longer bear the weight of her secrets, of her shame. She had to tell him. He deserved to know the full truth of what he was protecting. "Brother Hawthorne," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He had a way of touching me, like I was a piece of property he was polishing, or a dog he was teaching a lesson. She took a shuddering breath, the words like shards of glass in her throat. "I have not been touched kindly in years. I do not think I remember what it feels like." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. He did not speak. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a terrible, bleak anger. Not at her, but at the men who had hurt her. He rose from his chair and knelt before her. Just as he had done that night he had first touched her shoulder. He did not offer words of comfort. He knew that words were cheap, that they could not heal the wounds she carried. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, and she flinched, but she did not pull away. He slowly, deliberately, lifted her hand to his chest and pressed her palm against the rough wool of his shirt. Beneath her hand, she could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was a rhythm of life, of strength, of a quiet, unshakable decency. It was the truest thing she had ever felt. He held her hand there, against his heart, and said nothing. He did not need to. In that simple, profound gesture, he was telling her everything, that he was real, that he was safe, that his heart beat for her. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. She leaned forward, and he met her halfway. Their lips met in a kiss that was not about passion, but about pain. It was slow, hesitant, a careful exploration of a terrifying new country. It was a kiss of shared sorrows, of two broken people finding solace in each other's wreckage. It tasted of wood smoke and salt and a desperate, aching loneliness. When they finally broke apart, they were both trembling. He did not try to kiss her again. He did not try to undress her. He simply pulled her into his arms and held her. He sat with his back against his chair, and she curled up against him, her head resting on his chest, her hand still pressed against his heart. He held her for hours, a silent, steady presence in the dark. He held her as if she were something precious, something worth protecting. And for the first time in her life, Eliza felt safe. She fell asleep in his arms, to the sound of his steady heartbeat. And for the first time in years, she did not dream. She woke in the gray light of dawn, still wrapped in his arms. For a moment, she felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. Then the reality of what had happened, of what she had allowed to happen, came crashing down on her. The shame was a bitter, coppery taste in her mouth. She was ruined. She was unclean, and she had brought her ruin into his clean, quiet life. She carefully, silently, slipped from his grasp and went outside. The morning air was cold and sharp, and it felt like a slap in the face. She sank to the ground, wrapping her arms around her knees, and began to weep. They were not the loud, frantic sobs of her nightmares, but the deep, silent, soul-shaking tears of a woman who had been given a glimpse of heaven and knew she was not worthy to enter. She did not hear him come out of the cabin. She only knew he was there when he sat down on the ground beside her. Not too close, but not too far away. "You deserve someone clean," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Someone whole. Not me." He was silent for a long time, looking out at the mountains as they emerged from the morning mist. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I am not clean either," he said quietly. "The things I have done, the things I have seen, they leave a stain. We are none of us clean. We are just survivors." But their fragile peace was about to be shattered. The sound of riders came again. Not two this time, but half a dozen. They came up the trail fast, their horses churning up the dust. Silas was on his feet in an instant, pushing Eliza behind him, his hand reaching for the revolver tucked into his belt. But it was too late. They were surrounded. At the head of the group was Brother Hawthorne himself, his face a mask of pious fury. Beside him was a man with a tin star pinned to his vest, a lawman. "That is her sheriff," Brother Hawthorne boomed, pointing a trembling finger at Eliza. "My poor, wayward ward, Abigail. This man has abducted her, filled her head with sin and lies." The sheriff, a portly man with tired eyes, dismounted and walked toward them. "I have a paper here from the circuit judge," he said, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "It says this girl is your legal ward, Reverend, that you have guardianship over her until she comes of age."
"She is not a child,"
Silas snarled, his hand tightening on the grip of his revolver. "She is my charge, before God and the law," Hawthorne said, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "And I am here to take her home." Two of the sheriff's men moved forward, their own guns drawn.
"Do not make this difficult, son,"
the sheriff said, his voice weary. "The law is the law." They grabbed Eliza. She screamed, a raw, terrified sound that tore through the quiet morning. She fought, kicking and scratching like a cornered animal. But they were too strong. They dragged her toward a horse, her bare feet scrabbling for purchase in the dirt.
"Silas!"
she screamed, her voice breaking. It was the first time she had ever said his name aloud.
"Silas!"
He stood there, frozen, his gun in his hand. There were too many of them. The law was on their side. To draw his weapon would be suicide, and it would not save her. He was utterly, completely powerless. They threw her onto a horse in front of Jonas, who wrapped a meaty arm around her waist, pinning her arms to her sides. Brother Hawthorne looked at Silas, a cruel, victorious smile on his face. "The Lord's work is never done," he said, and then they turned and rode away. Silas watched them go, watched as Eliza was carried away from him, her desperate screams of his name growing fainter and fainter until they were swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. He stood there until long after they were gone, until the dust had settled and the only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. He looked down at his own empty hands. Then, with a roar of pure, animal rage, he turned and punched the solid log wall of the cabin. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot up his arm, but he did not feel it. He hit the wall again and again, until his knuckles were split and bleeding, the dark red of his blood a stark stain against the pale wood. He finally stumbled back inside, his chest heaving, a terrible, hollow emptiness where his heart had been. His eyes fell on the small table by the fire. Lying there, where she had left it, was her skinning knife. Small, sharp, and deadly. A piece of her that remained. A promise. A vow. The journey south was a descent into a familiar hell for Eliza. Strapped to the front of Jonas Hawthorne's saddle, the world was a blur of dust and heat, the rhythmic jolting of the horse a constant, punishing reminder of her captivity. They rode hard, stopping only for brief rests where she was given a mouthful of lukewarm water from a canteen and a piece of hardtack she could not bring herself to swallow. Brother Hawthorne rode beside them, his face set in a mask of grim satisfaction, occasionally quoting scripture about the foolishness of stray sheep and the righteousness of the shepherd's rod. The lawman and his deputies, their duty done, had turned back at the edge of the county, leaving her to the mercy of a man who knew none. The town they arrived in was little more than a collection of sun-bleached adobe buildings huddled around a dusty main street. It was called Redemption, a name so steeped in irony it felt like a physical blow. The church stood at the far end of the street, a squat, whitewashed building with a crude wooden cross nailed to its steeple. It was not a house of God. It was her prison. She was taken not to a room in the parsonage, but to a small, windowless storage room at the back of the church itself. The air inside was thick and suffocating, smelling of old paper, mildew, and the dry, sweet scent of mouse poison. The only furniture was a thin, lumpy mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner. The heavy wooden door was shut, and she heard the sound of a thick iron bolt sliding into place. She was a secret, a shame to be hidden away in the dark. For the first day, she did nothing but lie on the mattress, her body a single, throbbing ache, her mind a merciful blank. But as the hours bled into a second day, a quiet, cold resolve began to form in the pit of her stomach. They had taken her body, but they would not take her will. When Hawthorne's wife, a woman whose name she had never even learned, brought her a plate of beans and stale bread, Eliza turned her face to the wall. The woman sighed, a familiar, defeated sound, and left the food. It remained untouched. Brother Hawthorne came to see her that evening, his large frame filling the doorway, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "You will eat, Abigail," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The body is a temple of the Lord. You will not defile it with foolish pride." She did not answer. She did not even look at him. She stared at a crack in the adobe wall, tracing its path with her eyes, retreating to a place in her mind where he could not reach her. "I have been patient with you," he continued, his voice rising. "I have been merciful. I took you in when you were nothing, a piece of gutter trash. I gave you a home. I gave you the word of God. And this is how you repay me? By running off with some godless killer in the hills? By shaming me?" He kicked the plate of food, sending beans and bread scattering across the dusty floor. "There are other options," he hissed, his face close to hers now, his breath sour with a familiar, sanctimonious rage. "There are men who run workhouses in the territories, men who are not as patient as I am, men who know how to break a stubborn filly. A girl like you, with your sinful nature, could fetch a decent price. You will eat, or so help me God. You will find yourself in a place that will make my home feel like the promised land." He slammed the door, and the bolt shot home with a deafening finality. She heard his heavy footsteps retreating. Then the sound of the main church doors closing. She was alone again, in the dark, with his threats echoing in the small, suffocating space. She thought he was trying to break her spirit, but he did not understand. He had already broken it. Long ago. What she was protecting now was something new, something fragile and precious that Silas had helped her find. It was not her spirit. It was her soul. While she starved in the dark, Silas prepared for war. The rage that had made him bloody as knuckles on the wall of his cabin cooled and hardened into something cold, sharp, and focused. He was a man with a singular purpose. He moved about the cabin with a grim efficiency, every action deliberate and precise. He took her skinning knife from the table and sharpened it on his whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone a prayer of vengeance. He cleaned his rifle and his Colt revolver until the metal gleamed, and he counted his cartridges, laying them out in neat rows on the worn wooden table. He was not just a homesteader anymore. He was the man he had been in the war, a man trained to hunt and to kill, a man he had tried to bury in these quiet hills. He packed his saddlebags with jerky, hardtack, and a full canteen of water. He saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding that knew the treacherous mountain trails as well as he did. As dusk began to settle over the high peaks, casting long, dark shadows across the valley, he mounted up. He took one last look at the small, solitary cabin, at the place where he had found a fragile peace, a peace she had brought into his life. Then he turned his horse south toward the town of Redemption and rode into the gathering dark. The journey was a descent into his own private hell. The rugged landscape, which had once offered him solace, was now a gallery of ghosts. Every shadowed rock formation, every twisted juniper tree, seemed to hold a memory from his past. The rhythmic clip-clop of his horse's hooves on the rocky trail became a drumbeat, summoning the phantoms of the war. He rode through the night, the stars cold and distant above him, and the flashbacks came. They were not gentle memories, but violent, visceral assaults on his senses. A flash of orange and red against a black sky, a burning barn, the screams of the horses trapped inside, the coppery smell of blood, thick and cloying in the humid Virginia air, the sound of a man begging for his mother as he bled out in the mud. And then came the memory he had fought the hardest to keep buried, the memory of his brother, Isaac. He had been younger than Silas by 2 years, a boy with a quick laugh and eyes the color of a summer sky. He had followed Silas into the army, full of a naive, patriotic fire. The memory came to him in sharp, brutal fragments, a panicked retreat through a burning town, the air thick with smoke and the screams of the wounded. He and Isaac had been separated in the chaos. Silas had taken cover behind a stone wall, reloading his rifle. When he saw him, Isaac was 50 yards away, trying to drag a wounded comrade to safety. A shell had exploded nearby, a blinding flash of white light and a deafening roar. When the smoke cleared, Isaac was gone. There was nothing left but a blackened crater in the muddy street. Silas squeezed his eyes shut, the reins tight in his fists. But the image was burned into the back of his mind. He had not been able to save his brother. He had failed the one person he was supposed to protect. The guilt was a cancer he had carried for a decade, a sickness that had driven him from his home, from his family, from the world of men. He had come to these mountains to be alone with his ghosts, to serve a life sentence of solitude. And now there was Eliza. He had allowed himself to care again. He had allowed another person's life to become entwined with his own. He was terrified. He was terrified of the violence he knew was coming, of the man he would have to become to save her. He was terrified of killing again, of adding another ghost to the crowd that already haunted him. But as he rode through the dust and the dusk, he realized there was one thing that terrified him more: the thought of losing her, the thought of failing again, the thought of her desperate, broken scream of his name echoing in these hills for the rest of his days. That was a fear greater than any other. It was a fear that pushed him onward, that gave his cold rage a white-hot edge. In her dark room, Eliza fought her own battle. The hunger was a dull, constant ache in her belly, but she ignored it. She had lived with pain before. What she could not bear was the silence, the utter, complete aloneness. So she began to sing. Her voice was weak and scratchy from thirst, a fragile thread of sound in the oppressive stillness. She sang the fragments of lullabies her own mother had sung to her, songs she had not thought of in 20 years. They were songs of meadows and wildflowers and gentle streams, songs of a world that no longer existed. But mostly, she sang to remember him, to remember the feeling of his hand on her shoulder, the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her palm. She tried to hold on to the memory of his kindness, a small, warm flame against the encroaching darkness. It was an act of defiance, a refusal to let Hawthorne extinguish the one good thing she had ever known. One night, the bolt on her door was thrown back, and Hawthorne stood there, his face contorted with rage. "What is that caterwauling?" he demanded. "Are you mad? Do you think this is a saloon?"
I was singing,
she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You will be praying," he snarled. "You will get on your knees, and you will pray for the forgiveness of your wicked, sinful heart." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady in the dim lantern light that spilled in from the hallway. "I will not pray to your God," she said. His face turned a dark, mottled red. He strode into the room and loomed over her. "You will do as I say, girl," he hissed. "You are in the house of the Lord." "This is not a house of the Lord," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "It is just a building, and you are not a man of God. You are just a man." For a moment, he was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Then his piety dissolved completely, revealing the raw, ugly violence that lay beneath. His hand flew out and struck her across the face. The blow was sharp and brutal. Snapping her head to the side, the crack of his palm on her skin echoing in the small room. Her cheekbone exploded with pain, and she tasted blood in her mouth. She fell back against the wall, stunned, a high-pitched ringing in her ears. He stood over her, breathing heavily, his chest puffed out with a bully's pride. "You will learn respect," he said, his voice trembling with fury. "You will all learn it." He turned and stormed out, slamming and bolting the door behind him. Eliza lay on the floor, the pain in her cheek a dull, throbbing fire, but it was nothing compared to the pain she had endured before. This time was different. This time, she was not just a victim. This time, she knew that somewhere out there, in the dust and the dark, help was coming. Silas arrived at the edge of redemption as a storm was gathering. The sky to the west was a bruised, angry purple, and the air was thick and heavy with the promise of rain. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. He dismounted in a grove of cottonwoods a half-mile from the town and tethered his horse. He would go in on foot. He moved through the dusk like a ghost, skirting the main street, keeping to the shadows of the alleys and the spaces between the buildings. The town was quiet, the coming storm having driven most people inside. He could hear the tinny sound of a piano from a saloon, the lonely bark of a dog. He made his way to the church, his Colt revolver now in his hand, its weight familiar and terrible. He circled the building, looking for a way in. The windows were dark and shuttered. He came to the back and saw a single, heavy door, the door to her room. He tried the handle. It was bolted from the outside. He could hear a faint sound from within. Her singing. It was a sound so fragile and so brave that it broke his heart and solidified his resolve into something as hard and unyielding as granite. He went to the front of the church. He could see a faint light spilling from beneath the main doors. He could hear Hawthorne's voice from within, a loud, booming sermon delivered to an empty room. Silas put his hand on the door. It was unlocked. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of rain and ozone. And then the heavens opened. A jagged fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the entire street in a brilliant, searing flash of white. It was followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. In that moment of sound and fury, Silas burst through the doors. Brother Hawthorne was standing at the pulpit, a leather-bound Bible in his hand, his back to the entrance. He spun around, his eyes wide with shock and fear. "You!" he gasped. "Where is she?" Silas said, his voice a low, deadly growl. He raised the revolver, the long barrel looking like a natural extension of his arm. Hawthorne's face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed with righteous indignation. "Get out of this holy place, you devil!" he screeched. "You defile the house of the Lord." I am only here for what you stole, Silas said, taking a slow step forward. Then another. The preacher's eyes darted around the empty church, looking for an escape. There was none. His bravado crumbled, replaced by a raw, animal terror. She is my ward. The law is on my side. Your law means nothing to me, Silas said, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. Let her go. Hawthorne backed away, his hands held up in a gesture of surrender. But as he backed past the pulpit, his hand snaked out and grabbed something from beneath it. It was a pistol, a small, pearl-handled derringer. He brought it up, his hand shaking, his face a mask of desperation. But Silas was faster. He had lived with violence his whole life. He had been trained in it, had survived it, had run from it. Now, he embraced it. His Colt roared, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The preacher was thrown backward, as if by an invisible hand, a small, dark hole appearing in the center of his white shirt. He hit the wall beneath the altar and slid to the floor, leaving a crimson smear on the whitewashed wall. The derringer clattered from his lifeless fingers. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas did not spare him a second glance. He ran to the back of the church, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He found the bolted door and fumbled with the iron slide, his hands slick with sweat. He threw the bolt back and pushed the door open. Eliza was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. Her cheek was swollen and bruised. He rushed to her side, his gun forgotten. He pulled out her skinning knife and sawed through the ropes that bound her wrists. The moment she was free, she fell into his arms, her body shaking with violent, racking sobs. She clung to him, her face buried in his chest, her fingers digging into the rough fabric of his shirt.
You came,
she wept, the words muffled against him.
You came.
He held her tightly, his own eyes burning. He stroked her hair, murmuring her name, though he did not know it, just a stream of quiet, comforting sounds. He could feel the sharp angles of her body through her thin dress. She was starving. He pulled back and looked at her face, his thumb gently tracing the outline of the ugly bruise on her cheek. A fresh wave of cold, clean fury washed over him. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in the crook of his shoulder, unwilling to let him go. He carried her out of the dark, suffocating room, through the church where the body of Brother Hawthorne lay cooling on the floor, and out into the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, washing the dust from the air, washing the world clean. A few townsfolk, drawn by the gunshot, were huddled under the cover of a nearby awning, their faces pale and curious in the flashes of lightning. They stared as Silas carried the half-starved, bruised woman out of the church. He heard their whispers on the wind. Some called her a whore, others called him a murderer. But Silas did not look at them, and Eliza did not look back. They had a world of their own now, a world defined by the storm and the wilderness and the desperate, unbreakable bond between them. He carried her through the rain-swept street, away from the town of redemption and back toward the dark, waiting hills. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of water and wind. Silas urged his horse up the slick, muddy trail that led away from the town, away from the judgmental eyes and the body lying in the church. He held Eliza in front of him, her small, frail body sheltered by his own. She was too weak to ride alone, her head lolling against his chest, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The rain poured down in cold, unrelenting sheets, plastering his hair to his forehead and running in rivulets down his face. It soaked through his shirt and her thin dress, but it was a clean rain, a wild rain, and it felt like a baptism, washing away the filth of redemption. Eliza did not speak. She buried her face in the rough wool of his jacket, her hands clutching the front of his shirt with a desperate strength. She was trembling, not just from the cold, but from the violent, shuddering aftermath of her ordeal. He could feel the tremors that racked her body, and he tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer, trying to pour his own warmth and strength into her. He was her shield against the storm, against the world. They rode into the heart of the hills, the world becoming a blur of shifting fog, dark, dripping pines, and the slick gray faces of ancient rocks. The trail vanished, but Silas knew the way. This was his land, his sanctuary, and he moved through it with an animal instinct, his horse sure-footed and steady beneath them. The thunder rolled through the canyons, a deep, guttural roar, and the lightning lit their path in stark, momentary flashes, revealing a world of raw, untamed beauty. He was looking for a place he had found years ago, a shallow cave hidden behind a waterfall of rock, a place where a man could disappear. As the rain intensified, lashing at them with a renewed fury, he saw it, a dark slash in a rock face, almost invisible in the gloom. He guided the horse off the main trail, pushing through a thicket of wet, slapping branches, and into the sheltered space behind the rock. The roar of the storm was instantly muted, replaced by the steady, rhythmic dripping of water from the rocks overhead. It was not a deep cave, more of a wide, hollowed-out overhang, but it was dry and sheltered from the wind. He dismounted carefully, then gently lifted Eliza down. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the ground, and he caught her, holding her upright until she found her balance. She looked around the dark, damp space, her eyes wide and haunted. Then she looked at him, at his face, streaked with rain and grime, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective concern. For a long moment, they just stood there, the only sound the drumming of the rain outside and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Silas released her and turned to the practicalities of survival. He took a small axe from his saddlebag and, in the dim light, began to split the dry heartwood from a fallen pine log he had dragged into the cave. He worked with a quiet, focused energy, and soon he had a small pile of tinder and kindling. With a flint and steel, he coaxed a tiny spark into a flame, and a small, welcome fire began to crackle and spit in the center of the cave, pushing back the damp and the dark, casting their flickering shadows against the rock walls. He spread his bedroll near the fire for her, and from his saddlebags, he produced a piece of jerky and his canteen. He knelt in front of her where she had sunk to the ground, her arms wrapped around her knees. "Here," he said, his voice rough. "You need to eat and drink." She took the canteen with a trembling hand and drank, the water cool and clean in her parched throat, but she shook her head at the jerky. "I cannot," she whispered. He did not push her. He sat back on his heels, watching her, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, the deep weariness in his eyes. The silence stretched between them, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the violent, chaotic events that had brought them to this place. "I do not know how to do this," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear her over the sound of the rain. She was not looking at him, but at the fire, at the way the flames danced and consumed the wood. "I do not know how to love or be loved. All I have ever known is how to survive, how to endure, how to live until the next day." She finally turned her head and looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a terrible, aching vulnerability. "That is all I am, a survivor. There is nothing else inside of me." Silas looked at her, at this woman who had been beaten and starved and sold and hunted, and who had still found the strength to sing in the dark. He saw not an empty vessel, but a spirit forged in a fire hotter than any he had ever known. He thought of his own life, of the years he had spent simply enduring, simply surviving the ghosts of his past. "Survival is love. Sometimes," he said, his voice low and certain. "It is a kind of love for the person you have not yet become. It is a promise you make to the future. You fought to stay alive. Eliza, that is the only kind of love that matters when the world is trying to kill you." The name fell from his lips so naturally that he did not even realize he had said it, a name he had only heard her scream in desperation. But she heard it. Her breath hitched, and a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. He had given her back her name. He had given her back her story, and he had reframed it not as a tale of shame, but as one of strength. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks into the air. The storm outside began to subside, the rain softening to a gentle, steady patter. The world outside the cave was being washed clean, and inside, something was being washed clean, too. That night, something shifted between them. The fear and the desperation that had driven them were replaced by a profound, terrifying tenderness. She looked at him, sitting across the small fire, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep. She saw the man who had faced down the law, who had killed for her, who had carried her through a storm, and she knew she could no longer hide from him. Slowly, deliberately, she got to her feet. She stood before him, her small frame silhouetted against the firelight. He looked up, his eyes questioning. She did not speak. Instead, she reached for the hem of the torn, dirty calico dress, the uniform of her old life, and pulled it up over her head. She let it fall to the floor, a discarded skin. She stood before him in nothing but the thin, frayed chemise beneath. It was not a seductive act. It was an act of utter, terrifying vulnerability. It was a surrender. She was laying down her weapons, her defenses, her years of carefully constructed walls. She turned, showing him her back. A long, thin, silvery scar ran from her right shoulder blade down to her waist, a relic of a time one of Hawthorne's punishments had gone too far. There were other marks, too, a round, puckered scar on her ribs, from a hot coal that had fallen from the hearth when she was a child, the faint, crisscrossing lines on her wrists, almost invisible now, from the one time she had tried to end her own suffering years ago. These were the things she had kept hidden. This was the testament of her survival. She turned back to face him. He had not moved. His face was a mask of unreadable emotion, his eyes dark with a pain that she knew was not his own, but hers, which he was now taking as his own. She took his hands, his rough, calloused, gentle hands, and she laid them on her scars, first on her back, then on her side. She held his hands against her skin, forcing him to feel the history that was written there. He rose to his feet, his hands still on her. He looked down at the marks, his expression one of profound sorrow and a deep, quiet rage. Then he bent his head. He pressed his lips to the long scar on her back, a touch as soft as a prayer. He kissed the puckered mark on her ribs. He kissed the faint lines on her wrists. He was not just kissing her skin, he was kissing her pain. He was accepting every part of her, every wound, every memory. He was anointing her with a reverence she had never known. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release. He drew her to him, his hands moving from her scars to her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. They made love that night, on the rough wool of his bedroll, by the dying light of the fire. Their hands were trembling, his with a desperate need to be gentle, hers with the fear and wonder of a kindness she had never believed was possible. It was not an act to forget the pain of the past, but an act to feel something different, something more powerful than it. It was a quiet, desperate, beautiful collision of two lonely souls who were not trying to heal each other, but were simply agreeing to stand together in their brokenness. Afterward, she lay curled in his arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. The storm had passed. The only sound was the gentle dripping of water and their own quiet breathing. "I do not want to be afraid anymore," she whispered into the darkness. He tightened his arm around her, his lips brushing against her hair. "You will not be," he promised, his voice a low, rough vow.
Not with me.
She woke to the smell of coffee. The early morning light, clean and pale after the storm, was filtering into the mouth of the cave. She sat up, pulling the rough wool blanket around her shoulders. Silas was by the fire, which he had coaxed back to life, tending to a small tin pot that was perched on the coals. He had already been outside. His hair was damp, and his face was clean. He looked younger. The deep lines of weariness around his eyes somehow softened. He heard her move and turned, a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He held it out to her, and a small, slow smile touched his lips. It was a smile that transformed his rugged face, making him look, for a moment, like the boy he must have been before the war, before the world had tried to break him. She took the cup, her fingers brushing against his. The warmth of it seeped into her cold hands. She looked at him, at this man who had made her coffee in a cave at the edge of the world, and a feeling she had never known, a feeling of pure, unadulterated joy, bubbled up from a place deep inside her that she thought had died long ago. A sound escaped her lips, a sound she did not recognize at first. It was a laugh. It was not loud or boisterous, but a quiet, breathy, wondrous thing. It was the sound of a spring unthawing after a long, hard winter. It was the sound of hope. His smile widened, and he laughed with her, a low, quiet chuckle. And in that moment, in the clean, rain-washed light of a new day, they were not two survivors. They were just a man and a woman, sharing a cup of coffee, their laughter a fragile and beautiful song in the vast, wild silence. They rode back to his cabin later that morning. The world was alive, shimmering with a renewed, vibrant green. The air was clean and smelled of wet earth and pine. The land still stretched wild and cold around them, and they were still fugitives. A man with a killing on his hands and a woman with a bounty on her head. But they rode not as two people fleeing their pasts, but as two people riding toward a future. They rode like two people who had looked into the abyss and had chosen to pull each other back from the edge. They rode like two people who had claimed something worth dying for. The high, clear air of the mountains brought with it a fragile peace. The summer bled into a golden autumn, the aspens on the high slopes turning to fire, their leaves trembling in the wind like 1,000 tiny coins. Winter came early, dusting the peaks with a clean, white blanket of snow, and the world grew quiet, muffled, and still, in the small cabin, nestled in its grove of pines. Silas and Eliza built a life, one quiet day at a time. The rhythms of their existence were simple, governed by the sun and the seasons. He would spend his days cutting wood, the steady thud of his axe a comforting heartbeat in the vast silence. He hunted and trapped, and she learned to skin a rabbit with a steady hand, her initial revulsion giving way to a practical acceptance of the necessities of survival. They raised a small flock of chickens in a crude but sturdy coop he built, and her delight in finding the first warm, brown egg was a thing of pure, unblemished joy. Once a month, Silas would ride to a trading post a 2-day journey to the north, a place far from the memory of redemption, trading cured meats and pelts for flour, salt, coffee, and kerosene. They shared one bed, a mattress stuffed with fresh pine needles that smelled of the forest. They drank from one tin cup, passing it back and forth in the mornings as they watched the sun rise. And they shared one silence, a deep, comfortable quiet that was no longer born of fear or uncertainty, but of a profound and unspoken understanding. They could sit for hours by the fire, he mending a piece of tack, she patching a shirt, and not a word needed to be said. They spoke through shared glances, through the small, unconscious gestures of two people who have become attuned to each other's very presence. She began to read. He had a small, surprising collection of books tucked away in a wooden crate, a worn copy of Shakespeare, a book of poetry by a man named Whitman, a dog-eared volume on animal husbandry. She would sit by the fire at night, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips moving silently as she pieced the words together. She had never been taught to read properly, only to recognize the letters of the Bible, but with his patient help. The black squiggles on the page began to open up, revealing worlds she had never imagined. He, in turn, taught her the language of his world. He showed her how to mend a broken bridle with a needle and awl, how to read the clouds to predict a coming storm, how to mark a trail with a series of small, seemingly random notches on a tree or a particular arrangement of stones. He was sharing his life with her, not just the physical space of his cabin, but the knowledge and skills that had kept him alive. She was a quick learner, her mind sharp and hungry for a world that was not defined by walls and blows. But the world outside their small, quiet pocket of existence had not forgotten them. Whispers, like tumbleweeds, had rolled out of redemption, carried on the tongues of traveling merchants and passing cowboys. A story of a runaway ward, a murdered preacher, and a silent, dangerous man from the hills. The story, as stories do, grew and twisted with each telling. Brother Hawthorne, a man of God struck down in his own church. Abigail, a bewitching seductress. A Jezebel who had led a good man to ruin. The Hawthorne family was influential, with connections that stretched across the territory. They were not a people to let the death of one of their own go unanswered. They offered a bounty, $500, a fortune in that hard land, for the man known only as Silas, dead or alive, and the return of the girl. The news came to them, as news in the wilderness often does, on the back of a horse. The old trader from the north, a man named Jebediah with a face like a worn leather map, told Silas the story as they haggled over the price of flour. He did not know that the man he was speaking to was the subject of the bounty, but the description was clear enough. When Silas returned to the cabin, Eliza knew something was wrong the moment she saw his face. The quiet peace he had carried for months was gone, replaced by the grim, familiar mask of the soldier. He told her what he had heard, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. She felt a cold, sickening dread, the return of a fear she had foolishly begun to believe she had left behind. "It is my fault," she whispered, the old, familiar litany of self-blame. "I have brought this down on you." "No," he said, his voice hard. "He brought this on himself, and his family brought this on us." He looked around the small, simple cabin, at the life they had built. "They will come here. It is only a matter of time." "Then we will leave," she said, her voice rising with a desperate urgency. "We can go, Silas, deeper into the mountains, where they will never find us. We can go tonight." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not fear, but a cold, hard resolve. "We have run enough," he said. "This is our home. We will not be driven from it like animals." And so, they prepared for another kind of war. Silas became the man he had been at Gettysburg, a tactician, a strategist. He spent days fortifying the cabin. He boarded up the single window, leaving only a narrow slit through which to fire a rifle. He cut firing ports in the log walls, low to the ground. He dug a shallow trench behind a line of rocks 100 yards from the cabin, a place to make a stand before falling back. He hid his spare rifle and a cache of ammunition under a loose floorboard. He set snares and deadfalls on the main trail leading to the cabin, crude traps designed not to kill, but to slow an enemy down, to create noise and confusion. Eliza worked alongside him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her hands steady. She hauled rocks, sharpened stakes, and melted down scraps of lead to mold fresh bullets. The woman who had once flinched at the sound of a gunshot now loaded cartridges with a grim, focused efficiency. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the cabin dark and fortress-like around them, he laid the heavy Colt revolver on the table between them. "You remember what I taught you?" he asked. She nodded, her hand instinctively going to the weapon, her fingers tracing its cold, hard lines. "I remember." "Good," he said, "because I cannot watch every direction at once." "Silas," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I will not hide. I will not cower in a corner while you fight. You said it yourself. This is our trouble. I will fight with you. He looked at her, at the fierce, unwavering resolve in her eyes. He saw the woman who had survived years of torment, the woman who had sung in the dark. He saw not a liability, but an ally. He nodded slowly. I know you will, he said. They came a week later. At dawn, there were 4 of them, hard-faced men with the greedy, predatory eyes of vultures who had smelled a kill. They were not lawmen. They were bounty hunters. They rode up the trail with a careless arrogance, not expecting a fight. One of them rode directly into a tripwire, and a heavy log, weighted with rocks, swung down from a tree, knocking him from his horse with a sickening crunch. The other 3 immediately scattered, diving for cover, their surprise turning to rage. The air exploded with the roar of gunfire. Bullets slammed into the log walls of the cabin, sending splinters of wood flying. Silas was at the firing slit at the front of the cabin, his rifle barking, his movements economical and precise. Eliza was at a port on the side, the heavy revolver held in both hands, just as he had taught her. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, and the smell of gunpowder was thick in her throat. But her hands were steady. The battle was a chaotic blur of noise and violence. It was fast, brutal, and intimate. These were not faceless soldiers on a distant battlefield. They were men trying to kill them for money, and they were 20 yards away. Silas took one of them down with a clean shot to the chest as the man tried to run for better cover. The remaining 2 were smarter. They stayed low, moving from tree to tree, trying to flank the cabin. Eliza saw one of them, a big, bearded man, crawling through the underbrush, trying to get to the blind spot at the back of the cabin. She took a deep breath, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. The revolver bucked in her hands. The man cried out and clutched his leg, a dark stain spreading on his trousers. The distraction gave the last man his chance. He rose up from behind a rock and fired a wild shot toward the side of the cabin. Eliza felt a searing, white-hot pain in her left arm, as if she had been touched by a red-hot poker. She cried out, more in shock than in pain, and dropped the revolver, stumbling back from the wall. Silas heard her cry, and for a fatal second, he took his eyes off the fight. He turned to look at her, his face a mask of alarm. Eliza! In that moment of distraction, the bearded man, wounded but not out of the fight, raised his own pistol and fired. Silas was thrown back from the firing slit, a grunt of pain torn from his lips as he collapsed to the floor. The rifle clattered from his hands. Eliza saw it all happen in a horrifying, slow-motion clarity. She saw Silas on the floor, a dark, spreading stain on his side. She saw the bearded man, a triumphant, ugly grin on his face, as he struggled to his feet, preparing to finish the job. Something cold and clear and terrible settled over her. The fear was gone, replaced by a pure, crystalline rage. She did not think, she acted. She scrambled for the fallen revolver, her wounded arm screaming in protest. She rose to her knees at the firing port, the heavy gun feeling like a part of her own body. The bearded man was framed perfectly in the opening, a look of surprise on his face as he saw her. She squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, and the man was thrown backward, his eyes wide with a final, terminal shock. He fell and did not move again. The silence that descended was sudden and absolute, a ringing, deafening void where the chaos had been. The only sound was the ragged, pained gasps of Silas's breathing. Eliza crawled to his side, her own pain forgotten. His eyes were closed, his face pale and slick with sweat. The wound in his side was bleeding badly. "Silas!" she sobbed, pressing her hands to the wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood. "Silas, stay with me!" His eyes flickered open. He looked at her, then at the dead man outside the cabin. He looked at the revolver still clutched in her hand. "You did it," he whispered, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. "Good shot. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp. It was in this tableau of blood and death and desperation that the lawman found them. He was an older man, tall and thin, with a weary, patient face and a silver star pinned to a dusty vest. He had been tracking the bounty hunters for 2 days, knowing they would lead him to trouble. He entered the cabin with his gun drawn, but lowered it when he saw the scene before him. He helped Eliza bind Silas's wound, his movements gentle and practiced. He had been a doctor once, long ago, before he had started carrying a gun. He looked at the bodies outside, then at the preacher's bounty notice, which he pulled from the pocket of one of the dead men. "Reverend Hawthorne," the lawman said, his voice a dry rustle. He was a poison in this territory for a long time. Used the word of God as a shield for a dozen different kinds of wickedness. "I have been trying to build a case against him for years." He looked at Eliza, at the bruise that had long since faded from her cheek, but whose memory he could see in her eyes. "I imagine you know that better than anyone." He looked at Silas, who was breathing shallowly, his life hanging by a thread. He looked at the fortified cabin, at the grim determination in Eliza's eyes. He made a decision. "As far as I am concerned," he said slowly, "these men killed each other squabbling over the bounty. I will write my report as such." He looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. "But you cannot stay here. The Hawthorne family has long arms. They will send more men, if he lives," he said, nodding toward Silas. "You take him and you disappear. You ride up into the high country, into the mountains, and you do not come back. You become ghosts. If you do that, the law will forget you ever existed. It is the only pardon I can offer." Silas lived. For 3 days. Eliza nursed him, cleaning his wound, forcing water and thin broth between his lips, her own arm bound in a crude sling. On the 4th day, the fever broke. On the 5th, he sat up. On the 6th, they buried the dead in a shallow grave on the far side of the ridge. They packed what little they owned onto the back of Silas's horse, a bedroll, a few pots, the books, the rifles, and a small sack of food. Eliza looked around the small cabin one last time, at the place that had been both a prison and a sanctuary, the place where she had been reborn. Then she turned her back on it and did not look back. They rode north into the high, rugged mountains, where the peaks clawed at the sky and the wind blew cold and clean. They rode for days, pushing deeper and deeper into the wilderness, until the world of men was nothing but a distant, unpleasant memory. One night, they made camp on a high ridge, a carpet of stars glittering above them in the cold. Clear air, so close it felt as if she could reach out and touch them. Silas, still weak but mending, held her close, his arms wrapped around her as they shared the warmth of a single blanket. She leaned her head back against his chest, listening to the steady, familiar beat of his heart. "You never regretted it, did you?" she whispered, her voice a small sound in the vast, profound silence of the mountains. "Taking me in." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the star-dusted infinity above them. When he answered, his voice was a low, rough murmur against her hair. "Only that I did not do it sooner." He held her tighter, and she closed her eyes, a slow, quiet smile on her lips. They were scarred, they were wanted, but they were free. Together, they disappeared into the cold, starry night. Thank you for listening to our story. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from and connect with others. We invite you to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts.